So please join me in welcoming Bart Schenker.
In my many years of doing this, about 40, the only book I refused to do was the Da Vinci Code. And I want to make it clear, when the librarian said some people here have read it and would like you to talk about it, I went to a Barnes & Noble, I took it off the shelf, I read the first 30 pages and said, this book is badly written. You can like it, I didn't read it. I just didn't think it was worth my time. But I've done anything else after me. So, first a disclaimer, I had some non-scheduled dental work today, and I had an option of drugging myself and not driving, or not drugging myself and driving. Here I am. So you'll be patient with no. And I want to say that the turnout is extraordinary. Did Rob do that thing of saying everyone who comes gets $20? When I started doing book groups years ago, and I wasn't a known quantity the way I am in some places now, often before the session started, somebody would make one or two comments. One was, I love this book, which you'd love to hear that. The other was, who picks these books? So, a number of you have told me, either in speaking to me or by body language, that you love this book. When we first started designing these series, I said future classics, partly tongue-in-cheek, although I always try to pick books that I think are good. Not all good books are future classics. I think this is a phenomenally good book, and I think it will have real lasting power for reasons we can explain. I will say that it's my hope with every session that you become better readers. And yesterday, I was in Litchfield at the Oliver Wolcott Library, OWL, to talk about A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and 1943, and the people who showed up were very fond of that book. Many people have been fond of that book. And one of the women near the end said, can you tell me how I take a book like this that's a kind of straightforward book? You know, it's not complicated, it's not cryptic, it's a friendly, sentimental, well-written book. One of the reasons it's not taught in college classes is it's not tough enough. So I gave her some tips on how to be a better reader, and I want to infuse that tonight in some of this. When you read a book like this that you admire, now some of you may not agree with this, and I'll get to you. But if you like this book and you thought it was a good read and an important book, it strikes me as a book that calls attention to itself as a book group book. You know that there's good reason to read it because of its theme, because of its message, and so on. But you should also always remember that a novel is a work of art. And so anything is fair game in terms of what does this mean, even though there may not be a single answer to what does it mean. You should always be attentive to when you read fiction, this holds true for drama and poetry and fiction, to really pay attention to language, to pay attention to form. You may or may not have noticed that the book has 3 parts. We talk about 3 communities. 3 is the number of a crowd, right? There's you, there's this person you're really close to, and then there's this other annoying person who keeps saying 3 is a mystical number. People have suggested, way before the Trinity, way before Christianity, people have suggested it's because we are symmetrically binary, left and right, middle. There's this, there's that, and there's the other thing. There's no other thing, right? There's no 4th thing. You have this and that and the other thing. You have too hot, too cold, just right. Ask Goldilocks. We think of the world in terms of 3s. Another mystical number is 12. One of the chapters in this book is called 12, and someone has visions of 12, and 12 shows up a lot in literature and history. Knights of the Round Table, gods on Olympus, tribes of Israel, numbers on a clock, months of the year, and so on. It's thought to have that attention because after 12, you no longer have specific names for numbers. It's 10 and 3, 13. It's 4 and 10, 14. But 11 and 12 are not like 13, 14, 15. There's something about 12. Well, you may not have noticed that in the 3 parts, the first part has 11 chapters. And the last part has 11 chapters. They're incomplete. A couple of weeks ago, I was doing Housekeeping, the novel, not the work, on Marilyn Robinson. That has 11 chapters. That's a very biblical book. Marilyn Robinson is a secular writer, but she infuses her work with floods and fires and supernaturalism. It has 11 chapters for a reason, not quite that rounded number. So I do want to say that one of the things that makes this book appealing to me is it's a heaven and earth book. It is absolutely engaged in social justice, in American history. The Lincoln Highway was engaged in America in a different way. It's absolutely realistic in many of its incidents and portrayals. But there's a supernatural strain. There is a spiritual strain. Whether you believe in an afterlife, whether you believe in an almighty, there are religious people in the book. There are spiritual people in the book. So there's realism. There's what you might call supernaturalism or spiritualism. And then there's that middle ground where somebody can be called dodo or monkey pants. And you just accept that that's the way that it is. So the book opens with a hurricane, a kind of flood, another biblical image. Housekeeping begins with a flood. And I wonder, with that as setting the table, if anyone would like to get us started on fundamentally how many of you were here for the first time? Where have you been? Rob, you'll get names later. If you haven't heard me before, I tell people that if you want to run your own book group, and some of you I'm sure do that, you only need to ask 2 questions about a book. The first is, what is this book about? Which is not a simple question. And the second is, what is it like to read this book? Not do you like it, but what's the climate of this book like? A Jane Austen novel is very different from a Dickens novel, is very different from a James Joyce novel. And if you can get better at explaining the climate of the book, how you know that you're in Joseph Conrad or Graham Greene territory, you'll be a better reader. So let's start with that first question. What is this book about? Someday, I'm going to face the 40 or 50 of you. I'm going to stop talking and 4 hands are going to replace me. But this is not that day. Would anyone like to say what this book is? Yeah, thank you. Loud enough for everybody.
What isn't it about? It's about community. It's about disability. It's about loss. It's about, like you said, the supernatural kind of belief. It covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, so I hope you heard that. Yes, those are all good points, all those things and more. There are some things it's not about. The Three Stooges don't make an appearance, but I understand the spirit of that comment. It is a very all-encompassing book, and that's part of its greatness. It's this little community. It is these limited people in the sense of the economic status and the social justice act. You know, you can be institutionalized, that is to say, sent to prison, because you're a dummy, in the language of the day. So these are people at risk, but it is very broad in what it's concerned about. Yes?
I thought it was also about the difference between assimilation and the incredible respect for other cultures.
Yes, yes. So, you know, it's impossible to talk about this book and not be aware of what's happening in Israel and the Middle East and how much turmoil there is newly arisen about anti-Semitism in America. We don't have to get deeply involved in that, but we're aware of it. But it is this place, historical place, where 2 very different cultures found a meeting ground. There's a long history in America. It dates from about the 19-aughts, the 19-teens, of a collaboration between liberal Jewish Americans and African Americans, especially those who gravitated to the East Coast. I won't go into long detail, but some of it has to do with the timing of the Great Migration of newly middle-class or lower middle class African Americans moving from the South to the North in the first decades of the 20th century, after Jim Crow. And you can actually see maps where the people from this state went to this town, the people from, and so on. At the same time, Eastern European Jews were coming masses to America and found in impoverished or marginalized African Americans. I want to be careful. Not all the African Americans who came were poor, but they were poorly treated. And the same thing was true for immigrant Jews who suffered the problem of not speaking English or not speaking English without an accent and not being Christian. A terrible double whammy. So the blacks were Christian, largely, but they were black. And the Jews were white, but not to everybody, but they weren't Christian. And they formed a kind of alliance that was largely unspoken. And then in the civil rights movement, they estimate that about 50% of the lawyers who worked on the civil rights action in the South were Jews, liberal Jews, and a long history of that. You were waiting to say something.
Oh, I think you probably have said it, but to me it was about.
Louder for me, please.
To me
Yeah.
it was about possibility. And so many books kind of that cover racial disparities, and it's not about possibility. It doesn't show any optimism or any path forward, and this all came from the communication between all of these different people in the
Yeah.
most wonderful way.
Yeah, you know, it starts at the end in the sense that the grave is found and the mystery of who is this person that has these different things with him or her. But unlike many books, it not only has a happy ending, it delivers it at the end. I mean, we find out this boy, now a man, self-renamed, father of 5, living a very fruitful and full life. Fruitful is right out of the Old Testament, right? Turns out the holy men, the men they talk about in the Old Testament, turns out they're fruitful. You know what they're talking about. And we see that at the end, and then the gratitude in circling back that the last word of the novel is "Thank you, Monkey Pants." Hard to imagine a good book that ends with "Thank you, Monkey Pants." Other things that the book is about? I can't hear you.
Redemption.
Redemption. Yeah, it raises the question of who do you turn to when you need to be saved, when you need to be rescued, when you need to be helped. The famous line from Streetcar Named Desire is, "I've always depended on the kindness of strangers." That line is pathetic, that is, it brings out pathos, it's pitiable, for reasons most people don't recognize. Blanche can't depend on the kindness of family. You like to think you could depend on the kindness of people you know and love, people you know. Why is it you have to depend on the kindness of strangers? Because she's alienated her own family. She's an alcoholic, she's a liar, she's a loose woman in the standards of the day, she's a dreamer, she's not a lady, she pretends to be a lady, and so on. And so she's thrown back on the kindness of strangers. And the strangers are people who are going to have her committed at the end, right? It's a doctor and a nurse. You should be able to depend on the kindness of non-strangers, which is what this book is about. This book is about that remarkable network. It is not uniquely American. It's certainly not uniquely Pennsylvania, with all due respect to those of you who come there. Many, many cultures in the world have people who depend on the kindness of non-strangers. And this book is remarkable in, I think, the intricate plotting and the fact that the community comes together across racial and religious lines, despite racial and religious lines. Anything else that it's about? Yeah?
Well, despite the fact that many of the communities were marginalized, the people themselves were very skilled. They may not have had a lot of resources, they may not have had a lot of education, but they were capable of doing things, and that was brought out a lot.
Yeah, yeah. You may not be able to make bread, but you can dance. And this notion that behind the scenes, people with power are shutting off your water. That whatever they might say, the government, the man, the people who are invested with the power to actually help you are doing just the opposite. And all of the history, so much of the history of the Jim Crow South, that is, after slavery was technically outlawed, was using the laws as a club for newly freed African Americans, another kind of slavery. I think it's also about justice and mercy, and about the idea that the world needs to have justice. Martin Luther King's beautiful comment about the arc of history bends slowly but eventually towards justice. We want justice. Most people want what they want, and they call it justice. But we want justice. And the question is, what role does mercy have in justice? And what's the difference and similarity between those two things? I don't mean you can answer that now. But it's a question, for example, that's arisen in the relations between Palestine and Israel, not just now, but forever. Everybody wants justice if it's their justice. And everybody wants mercy if you're the one facing justice. In A Man for All Seasons, a magnificent play, when Sir Thomas More is brought in the middle of the night in the tower to be examined and interrogated, he says, I don't have to worry if I'm treated justly. He said, well, we're threatening you with justice. And he says, well, if it's justice, then I'm not threatened. If it's really justice and not just a punishment. So, what's it like to read this book where, in addition to these broad themes, if there was someone sitting in the room who hadn't read the book, you might think it was like a sociological treatise. It's a very compelling read. It's populated by really interesting characters. And I think of it, I happen to have, because of what they sent me, one of these large print reading books. And the first time I opened it, I had my glasses on, I opened it and I was blinded. Because I can actually read it without glasses. I think it's one of two big print books I have. It's a very compelling read. And I think it's memorable characters. I'm sure the movie rights have been sold. Anybody with any kind of name gets their book sold right away. Whether it gets made is another issue. What's it like to read the book? If you were talking to someone who hadn't read the book, and you were trying to convince them they should spend their time reading it, what would you tell them about it? What's appealing about the book? Yes, please.
Part of it is the perseverance of the characters in the book.
The perseverance.
The perseverance.
Yeah.
And their beliefs and their understanding of other people
Yeah.
that lead them to persevere.
Yeah, and this is Depression and wartime America that the book is set in when we go back.
And they're at the bottom of the heap.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's a live-in book. Some
It's a
books,
what?
It's a book you can live in for a while.
Yeah.
There are some books that you read, and there are some books, once you start reading it, you slide into being there with all those people. And those are the ones that you really want to read because you live there.
Yeah. So I saw their hands in the back. I want to say, just yell out, hey, and we'll see you. But I want to say that when I did A Tree Grows in Brooklyn yesterday up in Litchfield, it was because the librarian there said to me months ago, we'd like you to come for 2 book discussions, and the people really don't want these wacky time frame, multiple narrators. They'd like a story, and I finished her sentence, with a beginning, middle, and end, in that order. And I said to her, I'll give you a list of 4 or 5 books that I think of as good books, even great books, but books that aren't modernist or cryptic. And one of them was The Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And the other one that we're doing next month is The Optimist's Daughter by Eudora Welty, a wonderful book, a coming-of-age story of a woman who's no longer a teenager. And I do think that one of the things that some people like and many people crave is to have good books, including New York Times bestseller books, be books you can slide into, that you can live in, that you can feel like, I know these people. And there are many contemporary books that prevent you from doing that, because they're not writing in that style. They're writing a book that you know when you're reading it, you're reading a novel. You know what I'm saying? James Joyce is one of the greatest novelists in history. But when you read James Joyce, except for Dubliners, the short stories, if you read Ulysses, you are aware on every page that you're reading a novel. A lot of people don't want to be aware that they're reading a novel. They want to live the novel. And so this book was partly welcome when I read it, when it first came out, because it's that kind of book. Now, somebody in the back, yes?
Well, it's very.
Okay, you're gonna have to talk a lot louder with the mask.
I am, or I guess I'm wearing the mask for you guys. But it's a very emotional book is how I would describe it to people. I felt that there were characters that you really, really loved. There were characters that you really, really hated. And it was both very inspiring, but also, really, really heartbreaking.
Very,
Heartbreaking.
yes,
You know,
yes.
I mean, and the scene with the whole relationship between Dodo and Monkey Pants. I'm a pediatrician, so for me, these children and children with disabilities and the way they managed to communicate, I mean, I just thought that whole idea of that was magical and also incredibly heartbreaking that, you know, Monkey Pants basically sacrificed himself.
Yeah, right.
To save
So-
Dodo. So there's just so many instances of these characters that you're incredibly moved by.
Yeah, and Shona is another one of those characters. People who are generous but impaired, psychologically impaired, physically impaired, prone to seizures, not able to do what they wish they could do, even when Dodo intervenes to stop Doc or to try to stop the sexual assault. He's not able to, but he tries. And he's an impaired character, not limited as a human being, but he's called Dodo because he's a dum-dum. I mean, that's where the name came from. And these people in extreme circumstances are still heroically committed to helping other people. It's a great thing. Yeah, yes.
I didn't have a good experience at the beginning. I was supposed to read it for a book club.
You
Read
say
about
again?
it.
You
I
have?
didn't have a good experience at the start. When I was supposed to read it for a book club, ran through it and found myself getting confused about the characters and so on, so I put it down.
Mhm.
Then for tonight, I said, okay, I'm gonna give it a
For tonight's
go.
meeting. You
Tonight's meeting.
hear that, Rob? Not just the book club, the library.
Right, right. I'm
Yes,
gonna
tell
keep
me
it-
more.
I'm gonna
Would you
keep
like to come
going.
here and sit next to me?
And so I finished it, and it was almost like two different experiences. I think he was a little rambling at the beginning, introducing all the characters, and so I was having a little trouble following, which I have a problem with other books too. But then once I got into the, like you were saying about living into it, I got to the end, and I tried to share the last couple of pages with my husband, and I couldn't stop crying. I mean, the emotion that he was able to build up to throughout this book and then to the end,
Yeah.
I thought was just phenomenal.
Now, I'd like to use my old line, we've never met, have we? But of course we haven't. But I didn't put you up to this, did I? Right. I want to say that in that same sense that there is a happy ending given to you, part of the emotion is, this is a novel with a bust out from a prison.
Yeah.
This is a novel with a plan to go through tunnels. You gotta find the guy who delivers the eggs. There's a warped guy called Son of Man who rapes boys. I mean, this is not a feel-good story only. This is a very dark story. Son of Man is a terrible character, and there's no counterpart to that. It takes a community to thwart him. He winds up dead, and when you get to the end, when you said you were weeping, you realize you've been through, and what you were saying too about the emotional roller coaster. It's not just, and then they have lived happily ever after. He's earned his fruitfulness. Other, yes.
I
I love the
Loud enough for them. I know you're
Okay.
looking at me, but they're all over there.
I love the way that McBride stretches every cultural assumption so that every character that you get to know well is totally human. You can identify totally with their full humanity, and I think, I don't never read an.
Can you hear that? You can identify the characters in their full humanity. One of the things about, I'm just helping because it doesn't, if you talk well but they can't hear you.
Oh, go for it.
When you write a book with quirky characters, it turns out they're very credible because most real people are quirky. Look around. And that one of the things you have to guard against is when you write a book that's important with a capital I, that is meant to be moral without being moralistic, that's meant to make you feel good about what human beings can do, you have to protect yourself from writing about impossibly good people. Things that just can't, it's just not possible that such a person would do such a thing for a non-relative. And one of the ways you do that is you make the novel have texture through quirkiness. Even the idea that Doc falls into an open manhole and then it's cemented over. And you know when that happens that he's the guy that the book started with. There's a certain kind of black comedy to that. And he's a terrible character. And that yoking of awful people, often men, have you met men? No. Often men in the novel, with the black comedy that you know things are going to turn out all right. A novel called The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, the novel that has such an infusion of charity for non-relatives, for non-strangers rather, that the sense of community, you know it's going to end well. You just don't know that you're going to witness it. And that's one of the things that brings you to tears. I understand that completely. Yes?
I just want to say that, the take on the impaired, and they really, it's, who really is impaired in the book? Not the impaired, by the way they thought and minded ingenuity versus the really mean-spirited population.
Yeah. And again, when this woman was asking me for tips about how to read a book, anytime you read in a novel, I'll limit myself to novels, short stories, something that is itself written or dreamed or imagined, like the dreams about coming in 12s. Writers are people who work at imagination. If a character in a novel has a dream, pay attention to that dream. It doesn't make the character a better person, but it makes them someone to pay attention to. If someone writes a letter, a poem, an advertisement, if you're reading a novel and somebody notices a sign and the sign is included in the novel, mark that and pay attention. People who write with words care about words. And so dreams matter. On the first page of this book, when they find the skeleton, broken glasses. We found a belt buckle and a pendant in the well, the cop said, and some old threads from a red costume or jacket, if that's what the lab showed. They produced a piece of jewelry, handed it to him, and asked him what it was. Remember, they'd called in the Jewish man the old Jew as an expert. A mezuzah, the old man said. It matches the one on the door, the cop said. Don't these things belong on doors? So a Gentile talking to a Jew, and in my magnified book, it's the bottom of the first page, mezuzah. So on the doorway to this novel, part 1, chapter 1, there's a mezuzah. It's been buried but not erased. And I have the right to say, you don't have to agree with me, but be careful, that whether it's intended by the author, that marker of a doorway to bless the people who come into this portal, part 1, chapter 1, serves the purpose of blessing this story. It's a mezuzah because there are Jews in the story. But it could be an African wind chime for all it matters. And that's the kind of thing that when you notice it, it makes a novel a work of art. Like noticing that part 1 and part 3 have 11 chapters, one short of 12. If you want people to notice that there are 12, make 11. You know what I'm saying? If you took the pi of that clock and cut out 1/12 of it and erased it, we'd be aware by that absence that it's 12. You may not care, and I don't mean this in any patronizing way, about the art of a novel. You may say, this is a good book, I enjoyed it, I kept my interest. That's fine. Books can do different things like movies and paintings. If you like a painting, I'm not making a joke now, because it goes with the carpet in your bedroom. That is a perfectly reasonable appreciation of a work of art, and I'm not kidding. If you like a book because it killed 2 hours while you were waiting for something to happen, art does that too. But if you want to appreciate the artifice, the art of the novel, not the social themes alone, not the things that move us to emotion of fear or worry, suspense, happiness, you have to pay attention to the language, to the form. Yes?
Just
Loud enough. Talk to, don't look at me. Yeah.
2 comments. As I'm listening to other people talk, I have a weird way of reading novels. I usually read quickly to find out what happens, and then at the end of the book, I go back to the beginning and
Okay,
read.
so
more
that's not so
deeply.
weird. It's not like you read it backwards.
Well,
You read it quickly, and then you read
I
it
go
again.
back and I start noticing things.
Excellent.
And 2 things that have happened in this room. You referred to the main character as Chona. And when I heard her name as I was reading it, I heard Hana. And the reason for that is that,
I'm sure you're right.
well, I don't know, I mean,
I'm
it's
sure
just the
you're
only
right.
time I've ever seen CH transliterated in that community. The people have pronounced it as with a H.
You're
So
right.
that was one. And then,
You have to remember, I'm in intense pain.
okay.
You think she bought that?
And yes, it's true, that it does something to your teeth, I'm sure.
Right.
But the other thing that I noticed, and it's kind of a nitpick, is somewhere in the beginning, when she's first being introduced, she's described as the youngest daughter of. And nowhere else in the novel is there any reference to siblings or other people related to her. And that kind of, it was one of those things that kind of bugged me. But it was a detail I noticed, and so as people are talking, I'm thinking, yeah, I noticed this and I didn't know if anyone else had. It doesn't seem to have any significance throughout the novel, except when you start talking about community and whose family.
You think that when he says, the narrator, author, that she's the youngest, that he has some responsibility for explaining who the others are?
Well,
The
why
answer to
use,
my question is no, he doesn't.
he doesn't, no, but why use the word youngest if she's
Because the
young-
youngest in the family is different from other people. You have kids?
Yes.
The youngest in the family is different.
Yeah,
I
okay.
have a youngest in my family. I have 3 kids. You don't need to know the other 2 to know that my youngest is the youngest. End of story. I'm serious.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
it's
why
just
he
one of
did
those
it. You
things-
don't need to know the list
Yeah.
of other people. Yeah, yeah. Family relations are what keeps the book together, even when families are not necessarily literal families. And again, everybody in this room knows this and has that experience by 1 or 2 or 3 removed. Yes.
I thought he did a wonderful job describing the 2 communities, the black community and the Jewish community. First of all, in the context of that time period, which was so critical for the Jews and for the blacks coming up from the South. And some of those themes resonate even today, which really struck me. So I give him a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that is, again, not uniquely American, but distinctly American, is the formation of communities through exclusion. So often, people who see themselves as Americans, and I'm talking now in decades and decades and decades of the 20th century, if we just focus on that, you form a community by who you don't let in. gated communities, even book clubs that I've been with have sometimes said, no men. You, Mark, okay. As one woman said to me, you're kind of a girly man. And she worried that I was offended. I said, it's the nicest thing anyone's ever said. When the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, before they touched soil at Plymouth Rock, they decided to write a contract of social expectations, communal expectations, the Mayflower Compact. They were only about 60 or 70, some number like that, of the people on the ship. It was more like 100 on the ship. Some of those others were crew members. Some of them were travelers coming to America for usually commercial reasons. And so they were a majority of people on the ship, but they weren't everyone. And in their document, they refer to themselves as saints with a capital S. Why not? That's a good club. Rob, if we name this book group Saints, you'd be packed to the gills. You know what they named the other people on the boat? Strangers, capital S. Which group do you want to be part of? My point is, before there was an America, before the Puritans made a colony on soil, they decided we're the saints and everyone else are the strangers. America began with this notion of you form community by exclusion. When the Congregationalists started populating the communities and the colleges, Yale was founded on the libraries of Congregationalist ministers. The Congregationalists said, we have an improvement over the Anglican Church that we were trying to purify. We believe that you don't need a pope, a presbyter, a bishop, a leader. You just need a congregation of like-minded persons. Methodism was partly based on a version of this. And people said, can it be as few as half a dozen people? Sure, sure. And then a woman named Anne Bradstreet, if you haven't heard of her, you should have, said, can the number be 1? You have to love a woman who said during the colonial period to church elders, can the number be 1? And they said no, can't be 1. So she went out and made her own Church of One. Emily Dickinson wrote in the same vein. So many people, men and women. Rosa Parks wasn't standing up just for black people. She was sitting down. She was representing the one who said no. That's American too. But the grease, the friction rather, is between the people who say, our community means you can't belong. That's how we define it. And the person who says, can I be my own community? Not around here, you can't. It's a very powerful thing. Democracy is a great thing when it happens. It's a great thing when it's aspired to. But often it is created by which are the demos, the people you exclude. We're coming up on the halfway point of our 90 minutes, if we go 90 minutes. So I'm going to call for a break. I want to say that I discovered yesterday morning, before I was driving up to Litchfield, that I could not find my copy of The Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I had taken it with me to visit in-law relatives in New York, and I had it in the East End of Long Island when my very wonderful niece-in-law, Mary, was looking at it because I had it on the table where I was reminding myself of people's names. And she said to me, Uncle Mark, my mother talks about this book all the time. Her mother, my sister-in-law, is in her 60s. She said, would I like it? I know this girl very well, this young woman. I said, I think you'd love it. Apparently, she then said, may I borrow it? And apparently, I then said, sure. Because she took it with her. Actually, she took it and I left. And when I checked with her mother yesterday morning, she said, oh, Mark, she thought you lent it to her. I said, please don't tell her I don't have it. I'll be fine. Tonight I have the book. I want to say another way that you can become a better reader is in the same way that workers in imagination care about people who show imagination. If you find that someone in a novel can remember or imagine, she thought of when her mother first told her, someone in a novel who can do that has special value in the novel. They may be a rogue or a villain. They may be a terrible person. But if they can imagine what it's like to be somebody else or somewhere else, they're of interest to the novelist. You can bet that Son of Man, is that his name, Son of Man?
Yes.
Never imagined what it was like to be somebody else. That's how you come to rape boys, because you don't think of them.
What
Who-
was the universal meaning of Son of Man, his name? What was the meaning of, is there?
Okay, I'm in the middle of a thought I'm trying to finish. Can you hold up just a second? This is me. Wait.
Okay, first.
Who wrote Atonement? Yes. So he said that if the people who brought down those buildings and planes on 9/11 had had true empathy and really could know what it's like to be the people they were going to kill or terrify, they couldn't do it. And that one of the things you learn from reading novels is empathy and compassion. So if you read a novel in which somebody is remembering in detail, imagining in detail, projecting in the future in detail, I'm not saying they're good. They are a person of interest to the novelist because they have an imagination. And one last thing before I get to you, I'm sorry to keep you waiting, is it is a human feature of communication that we talk about things in terms of what they're not. We make metaphors and similes all the time, not just poets. We say it's like such and such. It becomes poetical if you're comparing two things that aren't ordinarily thought of as similar. So you can't say that Barnes is very much like Noble, whoever they are. And you can't say that Wendy's is like McDonald's and expect to be poetical. But if you can take two things that are very different, that lovers who have to separate are like the twin legs of a compass that you use to draw a circle, as John done, that's something. So in a book that you're willing to give attention to and slow down and invest more time, if you make a little check next to every time something is compared to something else metaphorically. Not, it was as hot as that day in San Diego, that's not a metaphor. But to say he was like, and then whatever followed. Put a little S if it's a simile, put a little M if it's a metaphor. Simile uses a comparison word like as or then, he was stronger than Hercules. A metaphor doesn't do that. A metaphor just says, this Hercules showed up and did whatever. I want to make it clear, I'm not trying to convert you to being better readers. I'm trying to attract you into being better readers. And there are some ways that are very easy. It takes no effort, S, M, and then to go through. If you see early on in the novel that there's a theme of the tension between justice and mercy, men and women, past and present, the law and forgiveness, you might make a little code and put that in a margin, say here's another example of then and now, and so on. Thanks for your patience.
Oh, no, not at all, not at all, good stuff, thank you for that, that's great. I was just wondering about, Son of Man, if there's some universal meaning for his name, why he was called Son of Man.
Well, you know who the Son of Man was?
Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus. So it's documented that many people who are schizophrenic or whatever mental disorder they have associate themselves with great people. And for them people, whether they're Christians or not, that's Christ. Not only Christ. There was a study made 50 years ago called The Three Christs at Ypsilanti. Does anyone know this book? Have you ever heard of it?
Yes.
So it was in a treatment center, a psychiatrist decided to take 3 of his patients who all believed they were Jesus Christ and bring them into a group session. Absolutely medically immoral, just insane to do that, but he did it. I mean, it is. And he wrote a book about it. But it used to be a commonplace that people with megalomania would think of themselves as Christ, for example. So I think we're supposed to understand that he either took that name on himself or somebody gave him that name because he acted like he owned the world. Now, obviously, the irony is he is as anti-Christian as you can imagine, and I don't mean that Christianity has a monopoly on kindness, but he is nothing like the name he has. And of course, that itself is an irony that many times you take a name that's the opposite of what you are. So. Monkey pants you have to work out for yourself. Yes?
Son of Man, going back to that, what I thought about and was confused about was when Nate, right before he killed him, they looked at each other's eyes and there was sympathy there. And Nate said to him, "It ain't your fault."
Yeah.
Is this because of the whole system of growing up in that system of poverty and abuse? But I wanted more. I wanted a little bit more explanation of that.
Yeah, well, well, for one thing, I think there's only so much anguish you can put in a book. Let's start with the fact that to take someone who is mentally stable but can't talk and is known to be deaf and to punish him by putting him in prison that pretends to be a hospital, that brutalizes them. And I mean, however limited our experiences are about such things, I think of this when we did foster. Think about the countless people, especially children, who were brutalized in systems that were called care centers. And some of them in this very state, not far from where they're sitting, last week. I mean, and whether you're black or Jewish or some other kind of marginalized person, if you're not connected, that's how you're going to be treated. And it is the phrase that we used before, it's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking to think. And we know how good, how smart, how normal, to use that word, Dodo is. He deserves the fate he gets. But he almost never got there. About comparing things to what they're not, in Philip Roth's great book, Patrimony, a memoir, not a novel, the best book I think he wrote, although I admire his novels, his father, it's the chronicle of his father's last months, and the patrimony, the gift that his father gave him, that's different kinds of things in the book. And in the book, his father calls him upstairs while he and his wife, Philip Roth's wife, Claire Bloom, are having friends over, and the father confesses that he soiled himself in his pajamas as he went to the bathroom because he didn't get there in time. And Philip Roth said, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll take care of it." He got him in the shower, he took off his clothes, gave him new clothes, washed him up, and all the while his father is saying to him, "Please don't tell Claire about this, it'll be mortifying." When he's done and he gets his father in bed, he goes back to the bathroom and he looks and he says, there was feces everywhere. He didn't say feces, but am I being recorded? Yes. Yeah, feces. There was feces everywhere. And Philip Roth says, "I didn't know where to start. It was like beginning the writing of a new novel." Now, ladies and gentlemen, ladies and a couple of gentlemen, how many of us would look at that room? You can all imagine it. Some of you have seen such a room and think it's like beginning a new novel. It's because Philip Roth is a novelist. And when he thinks of an impossible situation, he thinks of the challenge of filling up blank pages. You know he is a writer because that's the kind of simile he used. Same thing's true of characters in books. Some of the books, you know people who always use the same kind of word to describe something. Agricultural metaphors or weather metaphors or food metaphors. It tells you something about them. It's not just what they say, it's how they say something like something else. there's a joke where a comedian says he knew that his relationship with his girlfriend was close to ending when she called out to him one day, oh vermin, I mean sweetheart. You get to know people from the language. Other things about what this book is like, especially if you were trying to pitch it to someone else, because the way to pitch a book is not to say, it's beautiful, is to give some sense of the texture. Were you going to say an answer to that?
No.
Yes. No, behind you.
I was going to say that I am going to say, I am saying.
You have to talk louder.
A lot of the metaphors are very funny.
Yes.
I just opened a page, and this is the part about when Malachi wanted to be a baker, and he says, his buns tasted like chopped liver.
Right. And again, I want to be careful. I don't want to make people who are from cultures other than mine quaint by saying, oh, they have this great expression. You know how racist or colonial it is to say to somebody, say that thing again that you people say, that, what's that great expression you use? That when you say, oh, Native American people, they had, water buffalo, and they called a hippopotamus a sea monster. They had all these interesting ways of talking. Well, my bed has a foot. I sit at the head of my table. I can shoulder a responsibility. All languages uses metaphors. But sometimes part of what leavens a book that is very dark is the comic creativity of its speakers. Mark Twain, you've heard of him, said that he was so good looking as a young man that once when he was walking down the streets of San Francisco in the rainy season, he was mistaken for fair weather. That's a funny guy. Have any of you read any of his other novels? He's
Yes.
quite well-known, an award-winning novelist. He's also a musician. You know that he's the product of a biracial family, and that informs his experience. Grew up in Red Hook in tenements till he was 7 or 8, I think. It's only 8 o'clock. We have more time. I'm not looking to end early, and I will be in pain whether I'm here or driving home. Don't worry about me. Yes,
I think the title is compelling.
you have to say again.
I think the title is compelling. It's
Yes.
not Heaven and Earth and Hell.
Yeah,
It's Heaven and Earth grocery store.
right.
So that drew me in, for sure.
Yeah.
Just to start.
Yeah, and it's also a grocery store.
Yes.
I mean, it's not the heaven and earth factory or industry or
Right.
market or multiplex. It's a grocery store. And you hear grocery store, and you know you're in a neighborhood. Some neighborhoods, including in Connecticut, don't have grocery stores anymore. Try to find a grocery, well, I date myself, but when I was teaching at Trinity College, you could not find a grocery store in downtown Hartford. They didn't have them. You had to go to the suburbs, to the exurbs to find a grocery store. Grocery stores, yeah.
And it's
Heaven and earth, but not hell.
Well,
Yes.
it implies variety, the grocery store.
Yes,
It implies selecting.
right.
I mean, it implies a
But-
lot of things.
But it also implies neighborhood.
Yes,
right?
yes.
The corner grocery, you go to the corner grocery,
Yeah.
right. It's modest, and that's why heaven and earth and grocery store, and that amalgam. And what she did is what McBride's family did, which is you didn't have to pay if you didn't have the money. And that's a kind of kindness that was repeated in those decades, in my experience, all over the tri-state area. I mean, through stories. I'm not saying people in Topeka didn't do that too, but I don't know people in Topeka. So yes, please.
Yeah, just as people are talking, it kind of sends things off in my brain, and this is set at a very specific time in history, but it isn't. It's like it could be now in terms of what's going on in neighborhoods among people from different ethnic or cultural groups. And there's kind of magic, and what I said to you during the break, a phenomenal efficiency in his use of language, given the number of topics and issues
Yeah,
that he.
you were making this comment on the break and I want to underscore it.
Yeah.
It's a remarkably economical book. When you consider how busy it could be in the hands of a less competent writer, the different strain, it's really remarkably concise and good use of when to have dialogue and when to have narrative description. Yeah. Yes?
I've been interested to know how important are editors now to writers?
How important are editors?
How important are editors? Do they go through a novelist's book and comment or?
Well, it's impossible to know in a particular book. If you're somebody with an established reputation, you're going to have a lot more independence than if you're somebody who is new. Editors are very important. They work for the houses that publish the novel. And whether the editor is just cleaning it up or whether the editor is suggesting a radical change depends upon the relationship between the editor and the author, the agent, and the publishing house. So an example that's in my head, the first version of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was titled, They Lived in Brooklyn. Doesn't have the cachet. It was not a novel, it was a thinly veiled memoir of her own story. Now, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is written as a novel, but it's very much her story, Betty Smith. But this was more straightforwardly about herself. It ended with her father's death from alcoholism, which happens in the longer book too, which happened in her life. And when he dies in the earlier version, which never got published, she lost faith in God. Well, she had already been established Betty Smith. Betty Wehner, W-E-H-N-E-R, born of German immigrants, not Irish, although on one part of her family there were Irish immigrants. She married a guy named Smith. She became Betty Smith. They divorced, she married a guy named Jones. I'm not making this up. She divorced again, she looked for a guy named Miller, I'm assuming. When she took it to publishing houses, they said there's a war going on. People don't want to read a book about an alcoholic father who dies and his daughter gives up faith in God. Think about this, Betty. And so they told her, change the title. Don't make it about yourself. Make it more obviously a novel, even though it can be based on yourself. And bring her further along in her coming of age. And because she was a very good writer, because she was ambitious, like Francie, and wanted to write a novel, she had only written plays, she did everything they said, and it became an instant bestseller. The United States Army invented the pocket book, the small book that could fit in the pocket of servicemen. They got the dimensions of the pocket of it, and they sent hundreds of thousands of pocket-sized books. That the first one, Tree Grows in Brooklyn, to soldiers overseas. My son, when I asked him the other day, a 40-year-old lawyer in Astoria, if he had ever read Tree Grows in Brooklyn, he said, I started it, but it was a girl's book. He's a nice guy, believe me, he is. These soldiers read it, and it reminded them of home. Yeah. And it became a bestseller. It's not been out of print in 80 years. Yeah. There's an example of an editor or editors saying do this, and a writer who is eager to be published as a novelist. She wrote 3 other novels in her lifetime. None of them ever registered. But The Tree Grows in Brooklyn was made into an award-winning movie a few years later, directed by first-time director Elia Kazan. It won an Academy Award for James Dunn, who played the father. It was then made into a radio play. It was then made into a musical. and then made into a TV movie. One hit wonder, but she's one hit, ahead of me. Not a bad record. Yes.
I don't know much about the construction of books, but somehow it seemed to me while I was reading this, it was like jazz music, because you have all of the different characters, but they kind of come in groups, and it's like a couple of different instruments, and it goes for a while where one set of characters is saying what they're saying, and that's their melody, and another group of characters is kind of discussing what's happening to them, that's their melody, and sort of at the end, it all kind of comes together where all the melodies work together.
Do you think of it as musically in the way it's presented, or that's just your apprehension of it?
That's just my feeling of it. Because it reminded me of music and the fact that sometimes in jazz, an instrument will go off by itself and then they'll come back together again. And the other instruments are still being supportive as that's happening.
Yeah, I make that distinction only because if you or one is musically inclined, you may see musical themes in a book that doesn't have them necessarily objectively, but you get to see what you see. And yet there are some books that do work with a kind of musical composition. I should make the point that it is dedicated to Cy Friend, who taught all of us the meaning of Tikkun Olam, that wonderful Jewish phrase that we are born to heal the world, that the world is damaged because that's the nature of the world. In Neoplatonic theory, which preceded Hebrew thought, when God made the world, he couldn't make it as perfect as he was because it was a creation and not the creator. So de facto, the world was less than perfect. And the Neoplatonists suggested that that's a different view than the Christian view that the original creation was perfect. Well, it was perfect until you put fruit on a tree and said, don't eat that. But that idea that we have a moral obligation, not just to look out for ourselves and not just to help our neighbor, but to heal the world, it's such a moving thought and so noble when people do it. Now, I want to say to did you count heads tonight, Rob?
I think we're a little over 50.
50, oh my goodness. It is a sad fact that many people who read books that are inspiring do not translate it into the way they treat other people in their lives. I'm not looking at anybody. I would never, no, I mean, it's just a fact. People read Dickens, and Dickens taught charity to thousands of Victorian readers who would still walk over an ailing child in the street. And it's not just the Victorians. It's one thing when we're being entertained. It's one thing when we read and we want to feel good. Good. Dodo got out. He became Nate II and had children and all that. And we close the book and we feel good. But what about the people in our own lives who need water in their synagogue or intervention for a child in distress? I don't want to be preachy, but ideally we want to take what we read and apply it. I've said this before in this room, 2 social psychologists some 10 years ago did a double-blind study testing their hypothesis. Their results have been questioned by people, and I don't doubt that that's true. But they believed that it was likely that people who were frequent readers of literary fiction, that is, fiction in which the characters were like people, so not genre novels like romance, western, spy novels, crime novels, where the people are really at the mercy of the plot, but novels where people had interior lives and were recognizable as human beings. They hypothesized that people who regularly read such novels, many of you I'm sure, maybe all of you, are more empathetic to people in their real lives because they've had practice. They've had practice feeling for other people. Tolstoy is said to have said, he probably didn't, that he looked around the world and saw nobody like Anna Karenina, so he made her. That is, he felt there was a lack in the world for such a woman, and he made her. And the idea that I know Holden Caulfield, or Hester Prynne, or Anna Karenina, or Huck Finn, better than I know any of you. I know some of you a bit. Most of you I will never know with it. And you're all real, I'm assuming. And none of those people are real, and yet I have a better understanding of their humanity because they're written by great novelists. And if you spend a lot of your time in the company of people you can know better than the people you know in your real life. I mean, you know your family members, your friends, but most of the people you know, you cannot know the way you now know Dodo. That's the wonderful thing about art. And they found that when they tested people's empathy before and after doing the double blind, people who were more conversant with imaginary people did better with real people. Extraordinary thing. It's the whole reason I travel the shoreline talking about books. Really, the whole reason is not to teach you to be better readers, but because reading enlarges your life. I have a nearly 5-year-old granddaughter. I think she's very precocious. I'm her grandfather. She did something the other day that I thought was very clever, and I said to her, you know, you're very smart. And she said, modestly, I know. Henry V, greatness knows itself. If you're smart and don't know it, you're not smart. So I said to her, you know the great thing about being smart, and I expect her to say, my nickname in the family is Barkin, I think I've told you that before. I expect her to say, no, Barkin, what's the advantage of being smart? Because I was going to say to her, you will have a better life. You'll be happier if you're smart. Instead, she said, because I can figure things out and teach people how to do that. This kid needs no help from me. Yeah. So I do think it's worth giving some thought as we leave the library that it's one thing to talk about being emotionally, morally, intellectually involved with a very well-written, moving book, to think about the possibilities of human community across different kinds of divides, to imagine that this is not just then, but could be now, what the future could be like. But I think it's also bracing to think it doesn't help if you don't translate it into something practical. And again, it may sound preachy, but. So I was last weekend when I had my book stolen from me, also visiting my 99-year-old father-in-law, who's down in Greenport, Long Island, on the North Fork of the East End, in a rehab center. And when I visited him the first day, I was there for 6 hours. We had 10 minutes on and off of conversation. But I was looking at him. He's very dear to me. The second day, I brought a bag of clementine. He declined any. And I went around to the people in his station, the nurses and attendants, and I gave them each a couple of clementines. Everybody likes clementines. I mean. And then I went outside and I had one left over, and there was a woman sitting on the bench. I'm talking about not wanting to be sounding too much like a preacher. And I said to her, excuse me, but would you like, she was about 80, would you like a clementine? And she said to me, oh, did you grow this? Very sweet, I'm not mocking her. And I said, no, but I know where to buy them. Trying to loosen it up. And she took it from me and she said, oh, but are you sure you can share it? You sure you have enough to share? And I said to her, trying to reassure her that I could pop for a clementine, I said to her, most everybody can share. And she said to me, oh, are you a preacher? I said, no, I'm an English teacher. And she held it like it was something important. You may remember the scene in Godfather 2, where the young Don Corleone, Robert De Niro, brings home a pear wrapped in tissue paper to his wife. They're living in a tenement. He brings home a pear. It's like bringing home a persimmon or what's that? A pomegranate. And she treats it like it's something extraordinary. She was holding the clementine. Like, I wish I had more. So we had a few more words of pleasantries, but she thought that because I had said something that sounded vaguely moralistic, I might be a preacher. Not a priest, but a preacher, good old-fashioned word. So all I can say is, go and sin no more. I'll be back. I hope you all have a lovely Memorial Day weekend. Let's remember what it's for. Let's remember what we're remembering. Have a great summer. And I think I'll see them on the other side, right, Rob? I'll be back. Thank you.